I thought saving him would give me a second chance at life. I didn't know it would take the only one I had left. The marble floor beneath my bare feet was warmer than it should have been. Heated, polished, perfect, nothing like the freezing concrete I used to sleep on. And yet I couldn't stop shivering as I stared out at the city skyline stretching for miles. Glass towers glowing like they belonged to another world. His world, not mine, never mine. And still somehow I was here, wrapped in silk I didn't choose, breathing air that didn't feel like mine to breathe. Because 3 nights ago I made a decision. In the rain that changed everything. It had been just past midnight, somewhere around 12:17 a.m. if the flickering clock outside the closed diner was still working, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones no matter how many layers you try to pretend you have. And I remember pulling my jacket tighter even though it was barely more than fabric at that point, walking past alleys I knew too well, keeping my head down the way you learn to do when the world forgets you exist, until I heard something I wasn't supposed to hear, a sound. Too sharp, too wrong for that quiet street, and I froze, heart stuttering, breath caught somewhere between fear and instinct, telling me to walk away, to keep going, to survive the way I always had by not getting involved. But something in me didn't listen. I don't know why I turned. Maybe it was the silence that followed, too heavy, too final. Maybe it was the way the rain kept falling like nothing had happened at all. Or maybe it was just that I had nothing left to lose. He was there, half hidden in the shadows, a man who looked like he didn't belong anywhere near a place like that. Not in the dirt, not in the cold, not broken against the ground like something the night had tried to swallow. And even then, even like that, there was something about him that didn't feel weak, something that made the air around him feel different, like the world itself was holding its breath. I should have walked away. Every instinct I had screamed at me to run, to pretend I never saw him, because men like him don't end up like that without a reason, and people like me don't get involved without paying for it later. But I didn't move. I stepped closer. One step, then another. My hands trembled as I knelt beside him, close enough to see the sharp lines of his face, the kind of features you only see in magazines or behind tinted windows of black cars that never stop for people like me. And for a second I hesitated, just a second, wondering if this was the moment my life would finally break for good, before I reached out anyway. His skin was cold, not gone, not empty, but close enough that it sent something twisting through my chest. And I remember whispering something I didn't even realize I was saying, something like "stay with me." Like I had any right to ask that of a stranger, like I had anything to offer at all. But I stayed there, in the rain, holding on to someone I didn't know, choosing him over the only safety I had ever understood, and I didn't realize it then. Not in that moment. Not with the cold biting through me and the city sleeping like none of this mattered. But that was the second everything changed, because I didn't just save a man that night. I chose a life I could never walk away from. I did not remember deciding to stay, only that at some point the rain stopped feeling cold and started feeling distant, like my body had already chosen something my mind had not caught up with yet. My hands pressing against his chest, counting something I could not measure in seconds or logic, just a fragile rhythm that refused to disappear, and I kept talking even though I did not know why, words slipping out in quiet, uneven breaths, telling him things that did not matter, things about nothing, about how I hated the cold, about how the city never looked at people like me twice, about how he was not allowed to leave now because I had already chosen to stay, and that had to mean something, even if I did not know what. His breathing changed first, not stronger, not steady, but present in a way that made my chest tighten with something dangerously close to hope, and I leaned closer without thinking, straining to hear it over the distant hum of traffic and the soft echo of rain dripping from fire escapes above us. And that was when his hand moved. It was small, almost nothing, just a slight shift against the pavement, but it was enough to send a sharp jolt through me, my entire body going still, as if the night itself had paused to watch. And then his fingers brushed against my wrist, not grabbing, not pulling, just there, warm enough to remind me he was still alive, and I forgot how to breathe. His eyes opened slowly, like it took effort just to exist, dark and heavy and far too aware for someone who had been that close to disappearing. And when they found mine, it felt like being seen in a way I had spent my entire life avoiding. Like he was not just looking at me, but through me, cataloging something I did not understand, something I did not want to understand, and I should have pulled away, should have stepped back, should have remembered every rule that had ever kept me alive, but I stayed. You should not be here, he said, his voice low, rough, controlled in a way that did not match the state he was in, and it made something in my stomach twist, because even like this, even barely holding on, he sounded like someone who was used to being obeyed. I swallowed. My throat dry despite the rain soaking through everything. Neither should you, I whispered back before I could stop myself, and for a second, just a second, something shifted in his expression, something almost like surprise, like no one had spoken to him that way in a very long time. And then it was gone, replaced by something colder, sharper, something that reminded me exactly who he was, even if I did not know his name yet. Why did you stay? He asked, and the question hit harder than it should have, because I did not have a good answer, not one that made sense, not one that fit the kind of world I had learned to survive in, and I looked down at my hands, still resting against him, still choosing him without permission. Because you were alone, I said finally, the truth coming out quieter than I expected, and I felt at the moment the words left me, the shift in the air, the way. The silence deepened, the way his gaze sharpened like I had just said something important without realizing it. Somewhere in the distance, tires rolled over wet pavement, a car slowing, then stopping, and before I could turn, before I could react, headlights cut through the alley, bright and blinding, and the world that had felt small and contained around us suddenly expanded into something else entirely, something louder, more dangerous, more real, as doors opened and footsteps approached with purpose, not rushed, not panicked, but controlled, precise. And I felt it then, the truth settling heavy in my chest, that the man I had chosen to save was not just someone who needed help. He was someone the world moved around, someone people came for, someone who would change everything the moment he stood back up. And as his fingers tightened just slightly around my wrist, just enough to keep me there, I realized I had not just stayed with him. I had been claimed by the choice itself. The light hit my eyes too hard, too fast, turning the alley from something hidden into something exposed, and I flinched instinctively, my hand tightening around his without realizing I was still holding on, as if letting go now would undo everything that had already happened. But the footsteps kept coming, steady, controlled, the kind that did not hesitate, the kind that knew exactly where they were going. And I felt it before I understood it, the shift in him, the way his body went still. Beneath my hands, not weak anymore, not fading, but alert in a way that made my pulse spike with something sharper than fear. Do not move, he said quietly, and this time it was not a warning. It was a command, the kind that settled into the air and expected to be followed, and I froze without thinking, my breath catching as shadows stretched across the wet pavement, long and dark, followed by figures stepping into the light, dressed too clean for this place, too composed for this hour, their presence cutting through the night like they belonged to it in a way I never could. One of them moved forward first, his eyes scanning everything in a single sweep before landing on me, and I felt it immediately, the calculation, the question, the silent demand for explanation, and for a second I wondered if I had made the worst mistake of my life, if this was the moment everything would collapse around me. But then the man on the ground shifted slightly, just enough to draw their attention back to him, and everything changed. Sir, the man said, his voice controlled but carrying something underneath it, something like urgency held tightly in place, and I realized then that they were not here for me. Not really. They were here for him, orbiting him, responding to him, and the weight of that settled heavy in my chest as I slowly pulled my hand back, suddenly aware of how out of place I must look, soaked, shaking, standing too close to someone I clearly did not belong near. She stays, he said before anyone could speak again, his voice low but absolute, and the words landed harder than anything else that had happened that night, because they were not directed at me, they were directed at them, and yet they changed everything about where I stood. The man who had spoken first hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, but it was enough for me to see it, the shift from doubt to acceptance, the silent agreement that whatever he said was final, and then he nodded once, sharp and immediate, as if that settled it. I should have left then. That was my chance. The moment the attention moved away from me, the moment I could have stepped back into the shadows and disappeared the way I always had, but my feet did not move, my body still caught between instinct and something else I could not name, something that kept me there even as the world around him expanded into something bigger, louder, more controlled. They helped him sit up carefully, speaking in low tones I could not fully hear, but I saw the way they moved, precise, practiced, like this was not the first time they had done something like this was routine, and that realization sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the cold. His eyes found mine again, sharper now, more focused, and for a second everything else faded. The men, the light, the alley, all of it narrowing down to the way he looked at me, like I was no longer just someone who happened to be there, but something that had been chosen, something that now belonged to the story whether I wanted it or not. "What is your name?" he asked, and it should have been a simple question, something easy, something normal, but nothing about this felt normal anymore, and I hesitated, my voice catching before I forced it out. "Emily," I said, barely above a whisper, and the way he repeated it, slow, deliberate, like he was committing it to memory, made something in my chest tighten in a way I did not understand. "Emily," he said again, softer this time, and then his gaze shifted slightly, not away from me, but through me, already thinking, already deciding something I was not part of yet, and I felt it before he spoke, the change settling into place like a door closing somewhere I could not see. "You are coming with me." For a second I thought I had misheard him, that the words had slipped through the cold air and twisted into something they were not meant to be, but the way everyone around him went still, the way no one questioned it, told me I had heard exactly what he intended, and my heart stuttered hard enough that I felt it in my throat. "No," I said before I could stop myself, the word coming out sharper than anything I had said all night, and it surprised me almost as much as it seemed to surprise the men standing around us, because people like me do not say no to people like him, not when everything about him radiates control, not when the entire scene feels like something I accidentally stepped into and cannot understand. But I took a step back anyway, my shoes slipping slightly on the wet pavement as reality rushed back in. All at once. "I cannot," I added, quieter now, shaking my head as if that could undo whatever had just been decided for me, because this was not my world, this was not my life, and I knew better than to get pulled into something I would never be able to leave. His gaze did not change. If anything, it grew steadier, more focused, like my refusal had only confirmed something for him instead of stopping it, and that made my stomach twist with something dangerously close to panic. "You already did," he said, and the words did not sound like an argument. They sounded like a conclusion, something that had already been decided the moment I stayed in the rain instead of walking away. I opened my mouth to protest again, to explain that I had only helped, that I was not part of whatever this was, that I needed to go back to the only version of my life I understood, even if it was cold and empty and barely holding together. But before I could speak, one of the men stepped closer, not threatening, not aggressive, just there, creating a space that guided rather than forced, and I felt it immediately, the subtle shift of control that did not need to be loud to be absolute. "Miss, we will make sure you are safe," he said, his tone calm, measured, like this was a reassurance I should accept without question. But safe had never meant what it meant to people like them, and I knew that. I felt that, even as the exhaustion from the night began to settle heavier into my bones. I looked back at him, at the man who had said I was coming with him, searching his face for something, anything that felt like choice, but all I found was certainty, the kind that did not leave room for negotiation. "I do not belong there," I whispered, and I did not even know what there meant, his world, his life, whatever waited beyond this alley, but I knew it was not mine. For the first time, something in his expression shifted, not softer, not kinder, but different, like he was seeing something beyond the situation itself, something about me, about the way I stood there trying to hold on to a life that had never really held on to me. "You did not belong here either," he said quietly, and that hit harder than anything else, because it was true in a way I had spent years trying not to think about. The nights spent sleeping on sidewalks, the mornings waking up to a city that moved around me like I was invisible, the constant feeling of existing without being seen, without being chosen, and suddenly that version of my life felt just as distant as whatever he was offering. The car behind them waited with its doors open, the inside warm and dim, a sharp contrast to the cold air pressing against my skin, and I realized they were not going to leave without me, not because they could not, but because he had said they would not. My chest tightened as I stood there, caught between the only life I knew and something I did not understand, something that felt bigger, heavier, irreversible, and I hated how much the decision already felt made for me. My feet moved before I fully agreed with them, slow, hesitant, each step feeling like it carried more weight than it should have. And as I reached the edge of the open door, I hesitated one last time, glancing back at the alley, at the place that had been mine for longer than I wanted to admit, and I realized with a quiet, sinking certainty that I was not just leaving it behind. I was crossing into something that would never let me return. The door closed with a soft, final sound that echoed louder in my chest than it should have, sealing me inside a space that felt too quiet, too controlled, like the world outside had been shut off completely. And for a moment, I just sat there, my hands clenched in my lap, unsure where to look, unsure how to breathe normally again as the car began to move. The warmth hit me first, spreading through my soaked clothes in a way that made my skin sting slightly, like I had forgotten what it felt like not to be cold, and I shifted awkwardly against the leather seat, hyper-aware of everything. The faint scent of something expensive in the air, the low hum of the engine, the steady rhythm of rain tapping against the windows, and him, sitting across from me, silent, watching. I kept my eyes on the floor at first, on the clean, unmarked surface beneath my shoes, trying to ground myself in something real, something simple, but it did not work, because nothing about this felt simple anymore. And eventually, I felt his gaze too strongly to ignore, lifting my eyes just enough to meet his. He looked different now, not because anything about him had changed physically, but because the context had shifted, the shadows of the alley replaced by controlled light, revealing the sharp precision in everything about him. The way he carried himself even while sitting, like the space adjusted around him instead of the other way around, and it made me sit straighter without meaning to. "You are shivering," he said, his voice calm, observant, like he was stating a fact rather than asking a question, and I realized then that I was, my hands trembling slightly despite the warmth, my body still catching up to everything that had happened. "I am fine," I answered quickly, the words automatic, the same response I had given my entire life whenever someone noticed too much. But something in his expression told me he did not believe me, or maybe that he simply did not accept that answer as enough. He leaned forward slightly, not invading my space, but close enough that I could feel the shift in attention, the way the air seemed to tighten just a little, and before I could react, one of the men in the front seat handed something back, without a word, a folded coat, dark and heavy, placed carefully beside me. "Put that on," he said, and again, it was not a suggestion, not really, but there was no harshness in it, just quiet expectation, and I hesitated for a second, my fingers brushing against the fabric, softer than anything I had touched in a long time, before I slowly pulled it around my shoulders. The warmth settled over me instantly, grounding and unfamiliar, and I hated how much I needed it, how easily my body leaned into it despite everything in my mind telling me to stay guarded. "Why are you doing this?" I asked, the question slipping out before I could stop it, because none of this made sense, not the car, not the warmth, not the way everything seemed to revolve around him, and especially not the way he had decided I was coming with him like it was already written somewhere I had never seen. For a moment, he did not answer, his gaze steady on me, measuring something I could not understand, and then he leaned back slightly, the tension in the space shifting just enough to let me breathe again. "Because you chose to stay," he said finally, his voice quieter now, but no less certain, and I frowned slightly, shaking my head as confusion tightened in my chest. "I just helped you," I insisted, because that was all it had been, all it was supposed to be, a moment, a decision, not something that changed everything after. His eyes did not leave mine. "People do not stay for men like me," he said, and there was something in the way he said it, something that hinted at a truth I was only beginning to understand, something about the kind of life he lived, the kind of presence he carried, the kind of fear he inspired, and suddenly the memory of that alley felt different, heavier, like I had stepped into something far more complicated than I realized. I swallowed, my fingers tightening slightly around the edge of the coat as the city lights blurred past outside the window, distant and unreachable, and for the first time since I got into the car, a quiet realization settled into place, steady and unavoidable, that this was not just about gratitude, not just about being saved from the cold or given a place to sit. This was something else entirely, something deeper, something I did not have the words for yet. And as I looked at him, really, look this time, I understood one thing with absolute clarity. Whatever this was, it was only just beginning. The car did not stop for a long time. Or maybe it only felt that way because every second stretched too thin, my mind trying to catch up to a reality that no longer made sense. The city outside shifting from narrow streets I recognized into wider roads lined with buildings that looked too polished, too untouched by the kind of life I had been living, and I found myself watching the reflections in the window instead of the world itself, my own face barely visible beneath the passing lights. Unfamiliar somehow, like I had already started becoming someone else without realizing it. No one spoke. Not him, not the men in the front. Not even the quiet hum of the car seemed willing to break the silence that had settled between us. And it was not an empty silence. It was full of something unspoken, something waiting, something that made my chest feel tight with anticipation I could not name. I shifted slightly in my seat, the coat around my shoulders slipping just enough for me to catch its scent again, clean, expensive, nothing like anything I had ever owned, and I tightened it around me instinctively, hating how natural that felt. How easily my body adapted to comfort it had never been allowed before. "Where are we going?" I asked finally, my voice quieter than I intended, like speaking too loudly might break whatever fragile balance existed in the car. And for a moment I thought he would not answer, his gaze still fixed somewhere beyond me, focused on something I could not see. But then his eyes shifted back, steady and deliberate. "Somewhere you can rest," he said, simple, direct, like that was all that needed to be said. But rest had never been a place for me. It had always been temporary, uncertain, something that could disappear the moment I closed my eyes, and I did not know how to trust something that sounded so certain coming from him. The car slowed gradually, the movement so smooth I almost did not notice it at first, until the lights outside changed, brighter now, more controlled, and I felt the subtle turn as we pulled into somewhere enclosed. The echo of the engine bouncing off walls instead of fading into open streets, and my stomach tightened as the realization settled in that we had arrived. The door opened before I could react. One of the men stepping out and holding it for me, his posture respectful but firm, like there was an expectation in the gesture itself, and I hesitated, just for a second, my fingers gripping the edge of the coat as I looked back at him, searching again for something that felt like a choice. He did not move to get out immediately, his eyes meeting mine with that same calm certainty, and he gave a slight nod, not pushing, not forcing, but not leaving room for me to pretend this was optional either. And something in me gave in, not completely, not willingly, but enough for me to step out of the car. The air inside the structure was warmer than outside but cooler than the car, a controlled environment that felt just as foreign, and I wrapped the coat tighter around myself as I looked around, the space clean, organized, quiet in a way that felt deliberate, like even sound was managed here. They guided me without touching me, their presence enough to direct where I should go, and I followed, my steps slow but steady, my senses overwhelmed by how different everything felt, how removed it all was from the life I had known just hours ago. An elevator waited at the far end, its doors opening before we even reached it, and I stepped inside with them, the mirrored walls reflecting too many versions of me at once, each one looking just as out of place as I felt, and I lowered my gaze again, focusing on the numbers lighting up above the door as we moved higher, farther away from the ground, farther away from everything familiar. When the doors opened again, the silence that greeted us was even deeper, softer, like the space itself absorbed sound instead of echoing it. And as I stepped out, I realized this was not just somewhere to rest. This was somewhere designed to keep the world out entirely. And as I stood there, unsure where to go, unsure where I fit in a place like this, I understood something I had been trying not to admit since the moment I got into that car. I was no longer just passing through his world. I was already inside it. The space opened around me like something out of reach of reality, quiet and vast and untouched, the kind of place where nothing felt accidental, where every detail seemed chosen, controlled, deliberate. And I stood there for a second longer than I should have, unsure where to look, unsure where I was allowed to exist in a place like this. The floor beneath my feet was smooth and spotless, reflecting soft light from above, and the windows stretched from floor to ceiling, revealing the city from a height I had never seen before. The streets below reduced to distant lines of light and movement, like everything I used to know had been pushed far enough away to stop mattering. "You can breathe here," he said behind me, his voice quieter now, not commanding, not sharp, but still carrying that same certainty, and I realized I had been holding my breath without noticing, my chest tight as if the air itself belonged to him, and I had not been given permission to take it. I inhaled slowly, the air clean, filtered, nothing like the damp cold I had grown used to, and it felt wrong how easily my body responded, how quickly it wanted to accept this, as if comfort alone could erase everything that came with it. "I do not belong here," I said again, softer this time, because the words felt weaker now, less certain, like even I was starting to question them, and that scared me more than anything else. He stepped past me without rushing, moving through the space like it adjusted around him, like every corner already knew him, and he stopped near the window, his silhouette framed against the city lights, sharp and still, and when he turned back to look at me, there was something different in his gaze, not softer, but more focused, like he had already made decisions I had not caught up to yet. "Belonging is not something you decide," he said, his voice steady, and the way he said it made my stomach tighten, because it did not sound like an opinion, it sounded like a rule, one I had never been part of before. I wrapped the coat tighter around myself, suddenly aware of how small I must look in a place like this, how out of place every part of me was, and I glanced toward the door instinctively, not planning to leave, just checking that it was still there, that I could, if I wanted to, if I needed to, but something in the silence told me that even if I walked out, I would not be walking away from this. "What happens now?" I asked, because I needed something concrete, something I could understand, but the question felt too small for everything surrounding it, too simple for a situation that was already too complicated. He studied me for a moment, his gaze steady, measuring something deeper than my words, and then he moved closer, not too close, just enough that I could feel the shift again, the subtle gravity he carried without effort. "Now you rest," he said, and there it was again, that same certainty, that same refusal to make it optional, and I wanted to argue, wanted to insist that I did not need anything from him, that I could take care of myself the way I always had, but my body betrayed me, the exhaustion settling in heavier than before, the warmth of the coat no longer enough to fight it, and I hated how much I needed what he was offering. A door opened somewhere behind him, quiet and smooth, revealing a room I had not noticed before, soft light spilling out into the larger space, and I hesitated, my feet rooted in place. As I looked from the room back to him, searching for something that felt like permission, like understanding, but all I found was that same unwavering presence, the same silent expectation that I would step forward. My chest tightened as I stood there, caught between resistance and exhaustion, between fear and something else I could not name, and slowly, almost without realizing it, I took a step, then another, crossing the distance toward that open door, and as I passed him, I felt his gaze follow me, not watching to control, but watching to confirm, and that was the moment it settled fully into place, heavy and undeniable. This was no longer about where I slept or how I survived. This was about something much deeper, something that had already started to reshape my life from the moment I chose to stay. And as I stepped into the room, I understood with quiet certainty that I was not just being given a place to rest. I was being kept. I did not realize how tired I was until the door closed behind me, soft and quiet, but final in a way that made the rest of the world feel like it had been sealed out completely. And for a moment, I just stood there, not moving, not thinking, my body caught somewhere between survival and surrender as I took in the room around me. It was too clean, too still, the kind of stillness that does not come from emptiness but from control, everything in its place, untouched, waiting, and I felt it immediately, that strange pressure in my chest, like I did not know how to exist in a space where nothing was falling apart. The bed sat in the center, large and perfectly made, the sheets smooth without a single crease, and I hesitated, my fingers tightening around the edge of the coat as I stepped closer, unsure if I was allowed to touch something that looked like it belonged to someone else's life. I had slept in places people tried not to look at, on surfaces that never held warmth for long, And now I was standing in front of something that felt too soft, too permanent, like it expected me to stay longer than I intended. I reached out slowly, pressing my hand against the fabric, and the softness surprised me enough that I pulled back. Slightly, like it might disappear if I touched it too long. And that was when it hit me, not the exhaustion itself, but the permission to feel it, to let it take over without worrying about what would happen if I closed my eyes. I sat down carefully, the mattress giving beneath me in a way I was not used to, and for a second I just stayed there, my hands resting in my lap, my breathing uneven, my mind still trying to catch up to everything that had changed in a matter of hours. The coat slipped from my shoulders slowly, pooling beside me, and I watched it for a moment, that piece of his world now resting beside me like proof that I had crossed into something I could not undo. And I wondered if I should put it back on, if I should hold on to it a little longer, but the warmth of the room wrapped around me instead, steady and constant, and I let it go. I lay back slowly, not fully, just enough to feel the softness beneath me, and my body reacted before my thoughts could stop it, muscles loosening, tension slipping away in quiet waves, and it scared me how easy it was, how quickly I began to let go of the tight control I had kept over myself for so long. I stared up at the ceiling, the light above soft and distant, and for the first time since the alley, the noise in my head began to quiet, replaced by something heavier, something slower, something that pulled me down instead of pushing me forward. I did not know how long I stayed like that, caught between waking and sleep, my thoughts drifting in and out, fragments of the night replaying in pieces I could not fully hold on to, his voice, the rain, the way he had looked at me like I was something he had already decided to keep, and every time I tried to push it away, it came back stronger, more defined, like it was settling into place whether I accepted it or not. At some point, I closed my eyes without meaning to, just for a second, just to rest them. But the moment stretched longer than I expected, my body sinking deeper into the bed, the tension finally breaking in a way I could not stop, and I felt it then, the shift, the quiet surrender I had been avoiding since the moment I stepped into his car. The last thing I remember before everything faded completely was the sound of the door opening again, soft, controlled, and even without looking, I knew it was him, his presence filling the space without needing to make a sound, and I did not move, did not open my eyes, because for the first time in a very long time, I felt something I had forgotten how to recognize. I felt safe, and that realization followed me into the darkness as I slipped into sleep, unaware that the moment I let myself rest in his world, I had already given him something far more dangerous than my trust. I woke up slowly, not because of noise, not because of danger, but because of something unfamiliar, something steady, something quiet, and for a few seconds I did not move, my eyes still closed, my body caught between sleep and awareness as I tried to understand what felt different, what had changed, until it hit me all at once, the softness beneath me, the warmth that had not disappeared, the absence of cold that had been a constant for so long it had become part of me, and my eyes opened, sharply as reality settled back into place. The ceiling above me was the same, smooth and distant, untouched by time or weather, and I pushed myself up slowly, my movements careful, like if I moved too fast it would all disappear, and I would wake up back on the sidewalk with nothing but concrete beneath me. But it did not disappear, it stayed, solid and real, and that realization sent a strange mix of relief and unease through my chest. The coat was still beside me, folded now, not where I had left it, and I froze for a second, my gaze fixed on it as my mind caught up to what that meant, that someone had come in while I slept, that I had not woken up, that I had been completely unaware, and a quiet tension slipped back into my body as I looked toward the door. It was closed, just like before, nothing out of place, nothing disturbed, and yet everything felt different now, like I had crossed another invisible line without realizing it. I swung my legs over the side of the bed, my feet touching the floor, and even that felt different, warmer, smoother, like the space itself refused to let anything feel harsh, and I stood there for a moment, steadying myself, trying to find something familiar inside a place that offered none. The silence was deeper in the morning, softer somehow, like the city outside had not fully reached this height yet, and I moved slowly toward the window, drawn by the light spilling through the glass, pale and quiet, stretching across the floor in long lines that felt too perfect to belong to the same world I had come from. The city below was already moving, cars sliding through streets, people becoming patterns instead of individuals, and I watched it for a long moment, my reflection faint against the glass, layered over everything I used to know, and I realized something then, something simple but heavy enough to settle deep in my chest, that I was no longer part of that world in the same way, not after last night, not after the choice I had made. You slept? His voice came from behind me, low and steady, and I did not turn immediately, my fingers brushing lightly against the glass as I let the sound settle, because even without looking, I knew it was him. The way his presence filled the space without needing to announce itself. The way everything seemed to shift slightly when he was there. I turned slowly, my heart picking up just enough to remind me that this was still real, still happening, and he stood near the door, composed, controlled, like the night before had never touched him, like nothing ever really did. I did not mean to, I said quietly, because it felt like something I needed to explain, like rest was something I had taken instead of something I had been given, and his expression did not change, but there was something in his eyes, something more focused, more certain than before. You needed to, he replied, simple, direct, and I looked down for a second, my hands tightening slightly at my sides, unsure how to respond to something that felt both true and dangerous at the same time. What happens now? I asked again, because the question had not gone away, it had only grown heavier, more urgent, and when I looked back up, his gaze was already on me, steady, unshaken, like he had been waiting for that question from the moment I woke up. Now, he said slowly, taking a step closer, not rushed, not hesitant, just certain, you stay. The words settled into the space between us, quiet but absolute, and something in my chest tightened as I held his gaze, because I understood then that this was not about a place, not about a room or a bed or a single night of rest. This was something much deeper, something that had already begun the moment I chose not to walk away in the rain. And as I stood there, caught between the life I had lost and the one I had been pulled into, I realized with a clarity that left no room for denial. Staying was no longer just an option. It was the consequence of everything I had already done.